Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Zurab. Well, welcome to Georgia's fantastic Tavern and to the final event in this wonderful festival of Georgian literature and arts. Now, Zurab, it's a huge privilege to talk to you. Zurab Karumidze is an enormously versatile and prolific Georgian writer whose work covers a wide range of genres, a wide range of topics. As a student in Tbilisi, he even wrote a thesis on the poetry of John Donne. He studied postmodern American fiction in Wisconsin. He's the author of several novels and books of short stories, including Dagny, which we'll talk about a bit later, which was published by Dalkey Archive Press and was in fact nominated for the Dublin Impact Award. He's also a great specialist in music and the author of an award-winning history of jazz. So we have an awful lot to talk about in our time. But after all, the focus of this festival is the incredible flowering of Georgian arts in the short period of the First Republic after 1917. So maybe, Zurab, we could start there. And I'd like to ask you why you think it's so important to remember the culture of the First Republic and that blossoming of the arts at that time from our perspective now, exactly 100 years after it finished.
Well, thank you very much, Boyd. I'm really pleased and honored to be part of this feast in the fantastic tavern. It's a great pleasure to meet you and have a chance to talk to you. Thank you very much for a kind introduction and generous introduction. Well, why the First Republic and why the art which flourished and exploded during the First Republic? The topic of First Republic is very important today for Georgia, which is trying to rejoin the European and Euro-Atlantic family, which it used to be part of, which is trying to become the member of this huge family and become a full-fledged member of the European Union, and again prove its kind of close links, very close links and deep-rooted affinities with Europe, European culture, and European democracy and liberalism. That's why we are kind of going back to the events 100 years ago, when Georgia was among the first very few nations which managed to establish a decent social democratic nation, when the Europe was made up of collapsing empires. One empire was already kind of refreshing itself and coming back, but still. And Georgia was very few of these of such European nations came with this very decent, very flexible, very open, very dynamic, vibrant, I would say, democratic nation state. This is exactly what we have been trying to build for the last 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's why we need to get back to the experience which we had 100 years ago, and to revive this ability, this worldview, say, and these values in us, which our ancestors so successfully materialized in the politics. Alas, it was not long lasting, but still it's very important for us to touch the roots of our democratic experience. And the art of that period is one of the best opportunities to do this, because it is aesthetics, it is something that brings you emotions, joy of life, broadening of your vision, and kind of insight into the depth of humanity and human beings, whatever.
Zurab, tell me, I'm really interested, when you were growing up still in the Soviet period, was this a lost history? Did people talk about it at all? Or was it taboo?
It was taboo. It was not lost. It was not lost because we would talk about it in the kitchens, at tables, with our grandfathers and their friends, and sometimes this generational mixture would happen at Georgian tables, as you know, traditional Georgian tables. They would tell some stories very carefully, very apprehensively, but still tell these stories. And we could also read some literature which would penetrate the Iron Curtain, and could give us some information. But mostly, we got the information from our grandparents.
Yes. So it was like an unofficial history.
Exactly.
Private.
It was a very strong. It was a very strong marker and element of our memory at that time for my generation.
And for you, what are the most important achievements culturally of that period as it affects your work? What have you drawn from most?
Well, first of all, it's political achievement, which they had. These founding fathers of the First Republic, they established the democratic, liberal democratic nation with vote for everybody. The women had vote at that time. And one of the members of the parliament was the member of national minority, ethnic minority, Azeri woman. She was a member of the first parliament.
Yes.
That was it. But of course, to me as a writer and a person more addicted to art and aesthetics, it was the art which exploded that time,
yes.
which was so innovative, so vibrant. Yes. It was so diverse. Those were the Renaissance people, if you look at yes. that. They were not just painters. They were painters, they were book designers, they were writers, they were stage designers, they were educators, they were polemists. Those were magnificent people, of course, and they inspire you when you look at them. And I've been kind of in love with this period. I generally adore modernism, all kinds of modernism, modernist art, yes. be it European, American, Russian, and of course Georgian. So that I even dedicated a novel to this period. It's called Caucasian Foxtrot. It refers to the episodes from 1926, which is still the period of very dynamic Georgian modernism. So that's the art of that period inspired us because we realized that we can not only imitate European and American novelty in the arts and innovation, but we can even sometimes go further and combine Georgian content with very progressive and avant-garde forms, and these combinations will be very organic and very strong and inspiring.
Yeah. Do you think there was something in traditional Georgian culture that made Tbilisi at that time such a fertile ground for innovation? In other words, could it build on something that was already there?
Okay, let's look at it from 2 points of view. One is typically social thing. Imagine the Russian Empire collapsing, there's a civil war in Russia, while here we have relative peace, the weather is mild, food is good, wine is terrific, and of course, this would attract a lot of people to Tiflis that time, as it was called, Tiflis. But on the other hand, if you look at the traditional Georgian culture, its visual arts, especially the church and mural painting, would inspire many modernist artists with its understanding of the space, understanding of kind of organization of the space. And of course, there were two persons in the late 19th century, which I would regard as the major first modernists to an extent, or pre-modernists in Georgian art and culture. Those were a poet, the Highlander poet Vazhab Shabela, who had a very unique style, and the self-taught so-called primitivist artist Niko Pilosmani. These two people provided a lot of food to the imagination, not only of Georgian artists and writers, but to the artists and writers coming from abroad.
Yeah, yeah. Now, what you said there is so interesting, because both of those figures you mentioned are, as it were, making a bridge between the pre-modern and the modern. They're using these elements that were identified as primitive or folkloric, but then transforming them into something very contemporary. Do you think that's a characteristic of the art of this period?
Well, if you look at the modernist and avant-garde values of that period, people who were creating that art were staunch anti-bourgeois and anti-classical people. They wanted to destroy, not just to deconstruct, but to destroy the heritage they had in Britain, say from Victorian period, Victorian era, and all this kind of bourgeois mentality. And they were referring to art which was, say, either primitive or which was pre-Renaissance. Pre-Renaissance art, which then inspired. And this happens everywhere throughout the modernism. If you look at the modernism in Europe or Russia, etc., because, say, Picasso and other artists are focusing on African visual arts, composers like Stravinsky also gets his inspiration from the pagan Russian dance and ritual culture. So again, something impersonal, something less romantic and subjective is attracting the artist at the time. And these kind of art is suggested by primitive art, pre-Renaissance art. And again, when I mentioned Vazhab Shabela and Niko Pilosmani, these are typical carriers of this aesthetic value and this message. They are impersonal in terms of the vision, in terms of perception of human relations. They are kind of archaic to an extent, but this being archaic is keeping them very dynamic and still going and going. This is something above time.
So the very old becomes the very new somehow. Exactly. And maybe what I'd love to do is talk a bit about how this plays out in music, which I know is a great passion of yours. Now, for people here and elsewhere, maybe one way into this is to talk about how music in Georgia relates to what's happening in Russian music. People will know the great revolution of the generation of Balakirev, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, all that channeling of these archaic elements into music that then ends up sounding very modern, and then obviously carried on with Stravinsky in the period of the Rite of Spring. What's happening in music in Georgia at that time? Is there the same mining of the past and of folk elements?
That time, actually, the music of that time is less focused on traditional and folk elements, because that time Georgian composers trying to catch up with the European forms. Yeah. And so the first major classical style opera in Georgia was written and was staged exactly during the First Republic. That's 1919, when composer, his name was Zakaria Paliashvili, wrote an opera based on the folk story, folk legend. It's called Absalom and the Tari. It's a love story. It's a love story between the king and the peasant girl. And he did this opera in style very close to European operatic standards. And this was a big event. There were a couple of operas written before this opera. One of such operas was written by the man named Meliton Balanchivadze, the father of George Balanchine, who then kind of transformed and reformed the ballet. But Paliashvili's opera, Absalom, was such a huge event that it became kind of something national, of some huge national importance. Yes. That we Georgians are Europeans and we can handle European artistic forms. So that time music was not that much oriented on folk and traditional kind of roots, but it was important in terms of, well, a lot of recording has been made at that time, mostly by foreigners who came to Georgia. Yes. And they recorded the folk singers.
Yes.
And it's thanks to these recordings that we still are able to listen to this amazing singing from the late 19th, early 20th century, early 20th century. I mean, Georgian polyphonic singing.
Yeah. Do you think you talked about the wonderful Georgian tradition of polyphony and of choral singing? Do you think that the modernists of the period of the First Republic, were they sympathetic to their past, to their cultural past, or was there a sense, as in some other modernist movements, that you want to make a break, that you want to make it new?
You know, again, it depends. Some of them were trying to break up with the past and look into the future, and those were mostly so-called Cubo-futurists. Who were inspired by Italian futurists like Marinetti and other guys, and Russian futurists who also were based in Tbilisi at that time. But there were other modernists who were not rejecting their roots. Moreover, they're trying to merge, to fuse, say, pagan Georgian art and mythology with the European kind of philosophy, say, of Nietzsche, of French symbolists, of Commedia dell'arte, Eliot, etc. So these people were open to both sides, to the deep past, to the pagan Georgian past, like Stravinsky was open to Russian paganism and pagan experience, and they were open to European trends and to the future visions, of course.
Yes, yeah. I was very interested in what you were saying there about paganism as an aspect of modernism in the arts. Maybe this is the time where we could go back to your novel, Dagny, published, as I said, by Dalkey Archive, which of course it's not dealing with this period, but with, as it were, the earlier moment of modernist explosion around the turn of the 20th century. It's set in 1901. Could you maybe say something about Dagny herself and why she's such an extraordinary figure?
Well, Dagny herself, actually, I had a chance to talk about it in Norway last year, 2 years ago, in Lillehammer, the festival. Dagny herself can be regarded as one of the first modernists. This is the very dawn of modernism, I would say. She can be regarded as one of the first modernist women, because what she wrote was already out of kind of traditional 19th century literary forms. She wrote vers libre, free verse. She wrote, she was more attracted to symbolic kind of plays and short, very symbolic fiction. Besides her character, her nature was also unusually emancipated for that time. She was not completely considering herself being a woman of the 19th century style. She overcame this. She inspired many men around her. She was like Lou Salome for Germans, for Rilke and for Nietzsche. And she was a huge inspiration for Scandinavian artists and writers and for Polish artists and writers. Moreover, she inspired not only artistically then, but politically, because the Young Poland movement, who kind of were also close to her, because her husband, Stanisław Przybyszewski, was one of the leaders of this Young Poland movement. So she was to them the inspiration in these terms as well, in terms of independence, in terms of national sovereignty, and in terms of kind of renovating Poland and seeing the new Poland.
Yes, yeah. Now, what you do in Dagny is that you put this amazing woman at the center, and around her you bring in this extraordinary cast of, as it were, cultural superstars of the fin de siècle, everyone from Gurdjieff the mystic, all the way through to someone who is, I suppose, a kind of superstar, but not in a good way, the young Joseph Stalin. Could you say a little about how Stalin fits into this amazing drama?
Well, you know, I usually apply the term modernism not only to the artists, but you can apply it to politics. And if you look at the politicians who were coming of age of the time and then kind of made their first appearances and statements in 1920s, when the modernism was flourishing, those were also modernists to an extent. Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, Hitler, Mussolini, those were political modernists. Like modernists in the arts, they were totalizing everything. They wanted to see total picture, like modernist writers or artists. And they were kind of dehumanizing art, or life, I'm sorry, in this case, like the modernists tried to dehumanize art. Like Jose Ortega y Gasset, these kind of thinkers would suggest, and T.S. Eliot with his ideas of personality in the poetry. And so those people, since my novel is about some origins of modernism, and it's mentioned there that this is something new already being conceived, and it will come again of age very soon and show itself. So I can look at young Stalin as a future modernist, but in politics, ruthless. Because modernists in politics, I mean, came up with some monstrous pieces of art, political art.
Yes. You there's a very striking line in Dagny where you say that the art of death will come after the death of art. And maybe you could explain that a bit more.
It's such a suggestive image that I don't think how can I elaborate on this any longer. But yes, again, you can see the mirror image of artistic modernism and political modernism, which was inspired to an extent by artistic modernism. Don't forget, I think it was Walter Benjamin who said that Hitler aestheticized politics, but Stalin politicized aesthetics. So they got their inspiration from art, both Hitler and Stalin, and they were aspiring artists as young men, if you remember. Hitler was an aspiring painter, and Stalin was writing poetry. He was serious about that.
And the other very strong current in the novel is the sense that along with modernist experiment in the arts comes this pagan mysticism which again is still very much with us today in New Age beliefs, in sort of non-dogmatic spirituality. So you have it in the novel the figure of Gurdjieff, who of course is still a cult for many people. Maybe you could say something about his presence in Georgia at the time.
Well, his presence was very interesting in Georgia. He actually grew up in Tiflis. He was born in Gyumri in Armenia, but he grew up here. He studied here. He worked as a stoker in the railway station, but then he left. And for 20 years, he's been traveling. Well, then he came back, say, during the First Republic, he established here his Institute of Harmonious Development of Man. So, but then he had to flee Georgia because of the Bolsheviks coming in. Well, the thing with Gurdjieff and this novel of mine is that I was not that much interested with the ideas, and with the teachings of Gurdjieff as the guru of that mysticism and of the fourth way, etc. I was interested in Gurdjieff as a character and the mythology around him. The mythology which was around him, and the mythology which he created himself. I thought that it would be a very good addition to the story of Dagny coming to this town and dying. Yeah. Besides, when we talk of modernism, we always keep in mind that the paganism was a very important inspiration for modernists. Again, in visual arts, in music, in literature, it was huge inspiration for them. In a different way than it is today, with the New Age, of course. Again, they were trying to find some essential archetypal forms or archetypal structures around which they would build up their works. Take Ulysses by James Joyce. He takes Homer's kind of ancient pagan stories and builds his novel on this. Like Hitler and Nazis through German pagan times, upon which they built their aesthetics.
And in connection with that, there's this very interesting strand in the novel where you suggest that there is a sort of Georgian archetype, which is the archetype of the leopard or the panther, as opposed to the lion of other cultures. And you connect this with the very famous Nietzschean distinction between the culture of Apollo and the culture of Dionysus. So maybe you could say something about that in the Georgian context.
Well, writing this novel, I wanted to bring Georgia closer to non-Georgian speakers and non-Georgian readers. And that's why I tried to dig out some deep-rooted archetypal motives and stories. And of course, Dionysian is very Georgian because this is a nation of wine. And this is the nation which kind of invented winemaking. I think that's pretty possible. And that's why I'm trying to kind of come up with such distinction between Georgian culture as Dionysian, and other possible kind of cultures which are more Apollonian, more contemplative, more intellectual, more visionary. Georgians are more keen on, on things like ritualistic consumption of wines. Pagan Georgia, if you look at it, and perception of some holiness, of some harmony with the outer world. The space is full of wine. The space is full of sounds. Here comes polyphonic singing, and it's a kind of semi-ecstatic state. So when I was telling the stories of Georgia, I needed some points of departure from which to tell this, and so I did it about Dionysian, and I mentioned the panther because it is a reference to the major Georgian national epic, The Night in the Panther Skin. So I was going again to reread it in a parodic way to an extent. This is not a serious reading of this poem. Of course, I'm not a scholar of Gustav Edvard in these terms. And that's why I combined this with the Dionysian, this poem with the Dionysian rituals and experience, and of course also the Sufi rituals and experience to show that Georgia combines both West and East.
Yes, that's and of course to have a Dionysiac culture, you need cafes and taverns. Why did the cafe become such a crucial focus for cultural innovation in this period?
They're not only in Georgia, but elsewhere in the world. Yeah, that's interesting because again, cafe deals with cafe suggests Dionysian drinks, socializing, Dionysian getting together, Dionysian exchange of ideas, of emotions, and it's a very interesting topos for the polyphony of ideas, visions, values, and characters. That's it.
Yeah, that's. And do you think that cafe culture survives in Tbilisi now, or can it be revived? Maybe.
Definitely not this time during the lockdown and pandemic.
Yes. Well, but afterwards, yes.
Even before the lockdowns and pandemics, it's no more cafe today. Actually, the place of cafe are occupied by nightclubs.
Yes. Yeah.
Clubbers are today's cafe goers.
Yeah. Yes.
So the function of cafes moved to clubs. And moreover, these clubs are getting also politically ambitious. If you look at the rallies we had 2-3 years ago, those were not just political rallies demanding, say, the end to Russian occupation or whatever. Those were rave parties organized by the rave people. And they had the slogan, we dance together, we fight together. So this nightclub rave is getting political.
Yeah.
So the cafes are already ousted.
You mentioned the political dimension of nightclubs and raves. What about the political dimension of jazz, which is one of your great loves? Was that because I know that in the Soviet period, in places like the Baltic states, for instance, there was a kind of jazz underground, which was part of dissident non-conformist culture. Was that the case in Georgia as well?
Yes, sure, exactly. That was the case in Georgia too. Jazz enters Georgia somewhere in the mid-1950s. There were some early musicians who would play sort of jazz, Georgian musicians, and the first mentioning of jazz belongs to John Steinbeck.
Really?
Came to Georgia in 1947. They took him to a restaurant, and he tells in his Russian diary that these people tried to play jazz. They played saxophone, trumpet, etc. He was not very much impressed, definitely. So, but again, the first serious instrumentalists in Georgia appeared in the mid-1950s. And of course, immediately, jazz became something which would suggest something non-conformist, non-Soviet ideological, and of course the underground culture that time in Tbilisi was very much inspired by jazz. Moreover, I call these people who were the freaks, jazz freaks of that time, of late 50s, early 60s, I call them aesthetic dissidents. We didn't have that time big groups of political dissidents like they had, say, in Moscow or in Baltics, but we had aesthetic dissidents who were not accepting official Soviet aesthetics and would rather identify themselves with the jazz music, jazz world, and jazzy way of life. So
how did they come across jazz? Could they get hold of records, or did they listen to foreign radio stations?
This is another good story. This is another good story writing. There were some illegal recordings distributed, and those recordings were made on the X-ray films. X-ray films. I don't know what was the technology. I remember these recordings, but X-ray films with the bones still on these films, still pictured there with the remains of other parts of the skeleton, and they would record this and then sell them illegally, clandestinely.
Yeah.
And this is how the first recordings would enter Georgia. Then in 1956, and I wrote a novel about this. This is called Jazzmine. The United States State Department, but actually it was CIA. They launched a new project called Jazz Ambassadors.
Yeah.
And they launched a jazz program on the Voice of America radio station, run by Willis Conover. Every night, twice a night, he would play jazz music, very briefly introducing the musicians. And this radio show became part of the life of every young intellectual in Tbilisi of that time. They were trying to get this. It was not jammed successfully because it was in English, and the officials would not jam it. So we still could get it. And so illegal recordings, this radio program, which played a huge role. I mean, the destruction of Soviet ideology begins with this radio program, which was launched in 1956. The guy died in 1996. So he ran the program for 40 years. And there was an obituary about him in the Newsweek said that the American best known abroad, but totally unknown within the United States. Yeah, yes, and this was the major source. Then again, during the Khrushchev thaw, they would let some American musicians, part of this Ambassadors of Jazz project, to come and play in Soviet Union. And so these episodes were a huge inspiration, of course.
Did anyone come to Tbilisi?
Oh, sure. The first one, big name, came in 1962. That was Benny Goodman with the big band. Then come Earl Hines. In 1972, we had amazing band here, Ted Jones and Mel Lewis Orchestra, which already played some progressive jazz. And some jazz musicians would show up, but in 1989, it is still communist times. In 1989, but it's perestroika already, Georgian activists managed to organize an international jazz festival. Yeah. And they brought jazz megastars to Tbilisi, like Art Blakey, Freddie Hubbard, Saba, I don't know, Charlie Mingus Orchestra, etc. And this was a big explosion of jazz. So that's already 1989. It's perestroika. Soviet Union is about to collapse. Yeah. And there were also, in Soviet times, they would print some jazz music. Actually, just a brief historical episode. Stalin would not forbid jazz. Jazz was not banned in Stalin's times until 1947, when Churchill made his famous Fulton speech and described Stalin as dictator and Soviet Union as an evil state. That was the where Stalin said, no more jazz, and sent all jazz musicians to Siberia, to Gulag, where these jazz musicians were able to play jazz because the directors of the Gulag camps were jazz fans. Yeah, they wanted this music at their parties and at their events.
Well, that's really useful and illuminating, because it kind of throws a bridge between the the modernist innovation that we've been talking about in the First Republic and more recent movements of artistic liberation.
Yeah.
And Zurab, I think we're going to have to wind up now, but it's been a huge pleasure to talk to you. And thank you so much for joining us in George's Fantastic Tavern.
Pleasure.
So thank you. Bye-bye now.
Good luck to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zurab Karumidze in Tbilisi and Boyd Tonkin in London for so beautifully bringing together so many of the threads of this festival. Modernism and the First Republic, Pirosmani and paganism, Stalin and Dionysus, polyphony, jazz, and multi-ethnic Tiflis. My warmest thanks to Zurab for his generosity and time. If the festival has had a consultant on the First Republic and its cafe culture, it is Zurab. This, sadly, is the last Tavern encounter and the final event in George's Fantastic Tavern. You'll be able to watch all the festival talks for free via the website, georgesfantastictavern.com. I'd like to thank my wonderful festival associates at Writers' House in Tbilisi, including Natalia Lomuri, Maya Danelia, the indefatigable Nino Nadibaidze, and Salome Maglakelidze. And the fantastic festival partners, the British Library in London and Words Without Borders in New York. You can read newly translated novel extracts from 4 authors who appeared in the festival at the open access wordswithoutborders.org. I hope this augurs an increased flow of Georgian literature into English. Thanks to our many supporters and above all to the writers and translators who regaled us in the tavern in English, often their second, third, or even fourth language. In order of appearance, Nino Haratishvili, Aka Mochiladze, Dato Turashvili, Katie Melua, Becca Adamashvili, Lasha Bugadze, Nana Ekvitmishvili, Tamta Milashvili, Boris Akunin, Lynn Coffin, Tama Japaridze, Achil Kikodze, David Gabunia, and Zurab Karumidze. Huge thanks to the illustrious hosts, Claire Armistead, Boyd Tonkin, Maureen Freely, Wendell Stevenson, and Mark Gavissa. And thank you for joining us in George's Fantastic Tavern in this pandemic era. Stay safe.